The morning flight was supposed to be calm and ordinary. People were settling into their seats with sleepy faces, soft conversations, and the quiet hope that the journey would be smooth. No one on the plane had any idea that their day would become something they would remember for the rest of their lives. In row 9 sat two young twin girls around 13, looking out the window with excitement. They traveled often because their mother worked in another city, so planes never scared them. To them, flying felt almost normal, something they understood better than most children their age. The aircraft climbed through the clouds, engines humming steadily. The passengers relaxed as the seatbelt sign turned off. The flight attendants moved through the aisle offering water, blankets, and smiles. Everything felt safe. Everything felt controlled. Even the weather outside was clear, with the sky stretching blue and open. No one imagined anything could go wrong on such a perfect day, but around 40 minutes into the flight, something unusual happened. People in the front rows noticed the cockpit door open slightly. A flight attendant rushed inside, and another rushed out, her expression turning pale. She tried to stay calm, but her hands were shaking. A few passengers noticed and whispered among themselves. The tension moved quietly from seat to seat. Like a cold wind nobody could stop. The plane made a small dip, just a little, but enough for everyone to feel it. Someone asked what was happening, but the flight attendant didn't answer. She hurried toward the jump seat, grabbed the phone connected to the cockpit, and started speaking quickly. Her voice was low, but her fear could be heard clearly. The twin girls in row 9 exchanged a look. They were sensitive to small changes, especially on planes. Something was not right, and they both felt it immediately. Another minute passed, and the plane dipped again, this time more noticeable. A baby started crying. A man clutched the seat in front of him. The calm atmosphere was gone, replaced with worry rising slowly like water filling a room. The flight attendant finally stepped forward and spoke to the passengers, her voice trembling even though she tried to hide it. She said the pilot had collapsed and they were trying to reach ground control for help. A soft gasp moved through the cabin. People looked at each other with wide eyes, unsure what to do. The plane was still flying straight, but the idea that no one was fully in control filled the room with silent fear. The twin girls watched the flight attendant carefully. They weren't afraid, but their minds were racing. They had spent years learning about planes because their father taught them everything. He wasn't a pilot, but he loved aviation. He shared books, flight simulators, videos, and even took them to small airports to watch takeoffs. The girls knew more about cockpit controls than most adults. One of them whispered something to the other. It wasn't loud, but a woman sitting beside them heard it. She turned, surprised by the confidence in their tone. They were calm at a time when most people were frightened. The plane dipped a third time, a little stronger, and people began gripping their armrests. The flight attendants tried to reassure passengers, but their forced smiles only made the situation feel more unstable. The twins looked at each other again. They didn't want to cause trouble, but they also knew that waiting too long could make things worse. They could feel the tension in the air, like everyone was frozen between hope and panic. And then it happened, without thinking. Both girls rose from their seats. Their voices cut through the noise around them as they shouted words that made the entire cabin fall silent. "We can fly this." Every head turned toward them. Even the flight attendants stared, unsure if they had heard correctly. The twins didn't look scared or unsure. They stood straight, steady, almost strangely confident for their age. The passengers stared in disbelief, their fear pausing for one brief moment as hope unexpected and strange entered the room. No one knew if these girls were serious. No one knew if they truly understood what they were saying. But the way they said it, it didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like two young minds stepping forward at the exact moment the world needed them, and that was the moment everything changed on the plane. Asterisk. The entire cabin went silent after the twin girls made their bold announcement. Their voices were young, but steady. No shaking, no fear. The passengers looked at them with confusion, disbelief, and a strange spark of hope that no one wanted to admit yet. People usually panic in moments like these, but the girls had spoken with such clarity that it forced everyone to stop and listen. A flight attendant approached them slowly, like someone walking toward something delicate and unpredictable. She bent slightly, trying to speak softly so no one else would hear, but the whole cabin was too quiet. Her whisper carried easily. "What did you say? You can fly the plane?" The twins nodded at the same time, a habit they had since childhood. They explained that they had trained on flight simulators for years and learned real procedures from their father. They didn't claim to be professionals. They didn't act heroic. They just spoke calmly, like they knew the weight of their words, and were ready to carry it. The attendant looked torn. She wanted to protect them. They were just children. But the situation in the cockpit was getting worse, and everyone knew it. The co-pilot was trying his best, but he was alone now, struggling to keep the plane level. The slight dips were becoming more frequent. The engines were fine. The weather was fine. It was the human factor that had collapsed, one of the girls pointed toward the cockpit door and said softly, "If he's alone, he can't handle everything. He needs help, even basic help." The woman standing next to them felt something shift inside her. She had been terrified only minutes ago, but now she felt an unexpected sense of trust in these young girls. Something about the way they stood, so steady, made her believe they might actually know what they were doing. A man in the row behind them leaned forward. He had gray hair and a serious expression, the kind that carried authority without needing to speak loudly. He asked them what exactly they knew about flying. The twins answered every question with surprising detail: altitude control, trim adjustment, autopilot modes, flap settings, radio communication basics. They didn't sound like kids showing off. They sounded like students who had learned something with love and curiosity, the way some children learn an instrument or a language. The man nodded slowly, impressed but still uncertain. "You might really be able to help," he said quietly. Those words carried through the cabin like a message of hope. People who were trembling a moment ago now breathed a little easier. The flight attendant finally stood and looked toward the cockpit door, trying to decide if this was madness or a miracle waiting to happen. Before she could speak, the plane dropped again, this time sharper, making several passengers gasp. Even the overhead bins rattled. The twin girls held onto the seats but didn't panic. Their eyes remained fixed on the cockpit. They knew that drop meant something had gone wrong inside. The co-pilot was losing control. A flight attendant hurried out from the cockpit, clearly shaken. She whispered to her colleague, but the twins heard enough to understand. The co-pilot was overwhelmed, trying to keep the plane steady while also trying to revive the pilot and communicate with ground control. His hands could not do three things at once. The first girl stepped forward, her voice steady but urgent. "Please, just let us talk to him. We don't have to fly. We can help him manage things. We can follow instructions." The second girl added, "He doesn't need two pilots. He just needs one person who understands what he's saying." The attendants exchanged looks. They didn't have much time. Fear was no longer the biggest enemy, delay was. Finally, after a long breath, one attendant nodded. Not confidently, but with the acceptance that they were out of options. She opened the cockpit door halfway and signaled the twins to follow. Gasps filled the cabin as the girls stepped forward. People watched them with hope, fear, pride, and confusion all mixed together. The girls paused for a moment and looked back at everyone. A man whispered, "Please, help us," and that was enough for them to move. The cockpit door closed behind them. Inside, alarms were blinking. The co-pilot was sweating, tense and overwhelmed. He glanced at the twins, startled. But when he saw their calm faces, not scared, Not confused, he didn't push them away. The twins took a breath, ready to help save a plane full of strangers, and the real challenge finally began. The cockpit felt completely different from the cabin. It was tight, warm, and filled with the sound of warning tones that rose and fell like stressed breaths. The co-pilot sat in his seat, gripping the controls with both hands. His eyes were sharp but exhausted, as if he had been fighting a losing battle for far too long. When the twins stepped inside, he didn't speak at first. He just looked at them, confused, surprised, and unsure whether this was a mistake or a lifeline. One of the girls quietly asked if he needed help. Her voice was soft but steady, the kind of voice that didn't make things worse. The co-pilot exhaled hard, almost in relief, and nodded slightly. He didn't need someone to take over completely. He needed someone who understood the basics. Someone who could take small tasks off his shoulders so he could focus on the most important part, keeping the aircraft stable until instructions came from the ground. The girls didn't move recklessly. They stayed close to the door at first, watching everything carefully. They had only seen real cockpits from behind a rope in airports, but their father's training had made the panels, buttons, and screens feel familiar. One girl stepped closer and asked what he needed. The co-pilot pointed at the radio panel and said he needed someone to switch frequencies when ground control requested it. It was a small task, but in an overloaded cockpit, small tasks could save lives. The plane shook slightly again. Not a big drop this time, more like a warning that things were not stable yet. One girl placed her hand on the back of the co-pilot's seat to keep balance. The other leaned over the radio panel, careful not to touch anything she wasn't asked to. She repeated his instructions back to him slowly, making sure she understood. The co-pilot nodded again, faster this time. With confidence. Outside the cockpit door, the passengers felt every vibration and shift. They didn't know what the twins were doing now. They didn't know if things were getting better or worse. But they waited, listening to every sound of the engines, praying silently that the girls were exactly what the plane needed. Back inside, the co-pilot received a call from ground control. The voice came through the speakers with a calm, practiced tone, asking for an update. The co-pilot answered quickly, explaining the pilot's condition and the small control issues he was fighting. Then he nodded to the twin standing by the radio. She adjusted the frequency just as she had been taught, her fingers steady and precise. The co-pilot looked at her in genuine surprise. She did everything perfectly on the first try. The second twin noticed something else. The plane's trim was slightly off. She didn't touch it, she simply pointed it out. The co-pilot checked it, confirmed it, and made a slight adjustment. He looked at her with respect now. She wasn't guessing. She understood what she was seeing. Then a new alert flashed on the screen. Nothing dangerous yet, but enough to increase his stress again. The twins felt the shift in the air. The co-pilot needed more help, not with flying, but with staying calm enough to make the right decisions. One of the girls gently said, "We can read out the checklist for you. We know how to read them in order." He blinked, almost stunned. A full checklist was something he normally used in the cockpit with another trained pilot. But right now, he didn't have that. And these two young girls were offering something he desperately needed. Organized thinking in a moment where his mind was stretched thin. He handed one of them the checklist binder. She held it carefully, like it was something fragile and important. She didn't rush. She opened to the correct section and began reading slowly, clearly, exactly the way aviation training demanded. Her sister watched the control screens, alert, ready to help spot anything unusual. The co-pilot followed each step, flipping switches and confirming changes for the first time since the pilot fainted. The cockpit felt a little less chaotic. The warnings dimmed. The vibrations softened. The plane began to level out. In the cabin, people noticed. A mother holding her toddler felt the plane steady and whispered, "Something's working. Something's better." Hope spread quietly. Back in the cockpit, The co-pilot suddenly glanced at the twins with a different expression. Not doubt. Not confusion. Trust. He knew then that he wasn't alone anymore. And outside, the passengers had no idea that two young girls were helping hold a massive aircraft. Steady in the sky, but they were about to find out soon enough. The cabin had grown unusually quiet. People waited for any sign, good or bad. They could feel the plane calming, but no one dared to celebrate yet. A few passengers kept glancing toward the cockpit door, hoping it might open, hoping someone would walk out and say everything was under control. But it stayed closed, and that silence made every second feel longer. Inside the cockpit, the twins continued helping the co-pilot with remarkable discipline. They didn't sit. They didn't touch anything they weren't asked to touch. They stood steady, reading checklists, announcing small alerts, updating frequencies, and reminding the co-pilot of steps when the stress made him skip one. The co-pilot, still tense but more focused now, worked with their help like they were junior trainees who somehow arrived at the perfect moment. But then the situation shifted again, this time in a way they did not expect. The air around them changed slightly. The plane didn't drop, but it drifted left, just enough for the co-pilot to notice. He adjusted the controls quickly, but the drift returned a few seconds later. A subtle move, but a dangerous one, if not corrected. One twin leaned closer, reading the data from the display. She pointed at the wind direction numbers. Crosswinds, she said cautiously. The co-pilot confirmed it. They were entering an unexpected patch of strong winds. Something a second pilot usually helped handle, especially on longer flights. He wasn't panicking, but he knew managing this alone would drain his focus even more. The twins reacted without fear. They didn't pretend to know everything. Instead, they asked precise questions. What do you need us to watch? Which numbers should we monitor? Do you want us to read a section from the wind compensation checklist? The co-pilot told them exactly what to track: airspeed stability, small changes in altitude, and autopilot adjustments. They nodded and immediately divided the work between themselves, each taking a different instrument to watch. Their teamwork was almost instinctive. They didn't interrupt each other. Their communication was clean. It was the same way they solved puzzles at home, finished school projects, or navigated busy airports with their family. The co-pilot found himself glancing at them more often, not because he doubted them, but because they were doing more than he expected. They weren't just reading instructions. They were anticipating the next step, guiding him like a quiet support system. One twin noticed the co-pilot's breathing getting faster. The pressure was building on him again. She whispered gently, "Take a slow breath. We're here. You're not alone." Those words settled in the air like a steadying hand. He didn't respond, but his shoulders eased slightly. Meanwhile, the cabin began to sense the change in flight pattern. The turbulence wasn't strong, but noticeable enough to make a few passengers tighten their seatbelts. A child asked his mother if the plane was falling. Someone else whispered that maybe the co-pilot was struggling again. Fear started creeping back, slowly filling the silence. Suddenly, the cockpit phone rang. A flight attendant answered, listening intently. The co-pilot signaled for her to relay updates. She followed instructions, but her eyes widened when she heard ground control's next guidance. The landing would be difficult if the wind stayed strong. She looked at the Ponsonby twins, unsure if she should tell the passengers what was happening. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her expression carried enough weight. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot spoke firmly, trying to stay composed. "We may need to prepare early for descent. The winds could get worse." The twins stood closer, watching the data. One of them said, "We can help you prepare. Just tell us the order." He handed them another checklist, this one more complicated. They didn't hesitate. They opened it carefully, scanning the steps. They didn't try to lead. They guided at the pace he needed, steady, calm, clear. A few moments later, the plane shook again, not sharply, but enough to remind everyone that nature does not wait for fear to settle. The co-pilot adjusted once more quickly this time. Thanks to the warnings the twins had been giving him, a tiny voice from the cabin shouted, "Is everything okay?" The cockpit door muffled the question, but the twins heard it. They turned toward the door for a moment, their expressions soft. People were scared. They understood that. And they also understood something else. They had to keep going, because every person behind that door was depending on them now.
The passengers waited with restless eyes as the light turbulence continued. The cabin wasn't shaking hard, but every small movement felt bigger because of the fear building inside everyone. Parents held their children closer. Some people whispered prayers. Others stared at the seat in front of them, imagining every possible outcome. They had no idea what was happening beyond the cockpit door, only that the plane was not flying as smoothly as before. Inside the cockpit, the twins were focused like never before. They watched every number, every tiny change in altitude, and every sound coming from the instruments. Their earlier confidence hadn't disappeared, but it had turned into something deeper: responsibility. They knew now that their presence wasn't just helpful. It was necessary. The co-pilot leaned forward, adjusting a control with one hand while wiping sweat from his forehead with the other. He wasn't losing control, but he was running out of energy. The workload of two pilots rested on one person, and the twins could see the tiredness settling into his movements. One of the twins quietly read the next line from the checklist, giving him the next step at exactly the right time. The other twin pointed out a small shift in the altitude that he hadn't noticed yet. He corrected it instantly. Their teamwork blended smoothly with his, as if the three of them had practiced together before. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. Ground control checked in again. They asked for more details about the pilot's condition. They also asked for an estimated time when the co-pilot could begin descent. The co-pilot hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to admit they weren't ready yet. The winds were unpredictable, and he needed a few more minutes to stabilize the aircraft. One of the twins gently stepped closer and whispered, "Tell them we need more time. We can help you until then." She wasn't suggesting he delay the procedure. She was simply reminding him that he didn't have to face everything alone. The co-pilot nodded and relayed the message to ground control. His voice, though tired, carried more confidence now. Behind them, a soft knock came from the cockpit door. It wasn't loud, more like a concerned touch. The flight attendant peeked inside, asking if she could relay anything to the passengers. They were growing scared. She said a few people were crying, and one elderly man was having trouble breathing due to stress. The twins exchanged a worried glance. They hated the idea of people suffering behind them while the three of them fought to keep the plane steady. The co-pilot paused for a moment before answering. He told the flight attendant to reassure everyone that the situation was under control. He didn't lie. With the twins helping, things truly were more stable. The flight attendant nodded and closed the door again. Her calm steps down the aisle brought a small wave of comfort. Passengers watched her face closely, and the slight smile she forced was enough to make a few hearts loosen. Back in the cockpit, the twins noticed something new on the display: an upcoming weather patch. Nothing dangerous, but enough to make the descent trickier. The co-pilot checked it and sighed. "We might get a rough section on the way down," he said softly. The first twin responded immediately. "Then we prepare early." The second twin added, "Tell us what comes next." He handed them another checklist, this one for the early stages of descent preparation. It wasn't the final landing checklist, but it was still serious. The twins handled it with the same careful respect they had shown since entering the cockpit. As they worked together, the plane suddenly tilted slightly to the right. It wasn't a sharp movement, but it was enough to make the cabin react again. Someone shouted. Someone else grabbed their armrest so hard their knuckles turned white. The co-pilot corrected it quickly, but the tremor of fear spread through the seats once more. In the cockpit, nothing was said for a few seconds. The silence felt heavy. Then one of the twins whispered, "You corrected it fast. That was good." It wasn't flattery. It was reassurance. a reminder that even in difficulty, progress was being made. The co-pilot nodded, and for the first time he managed a small, tired smile. The twins continued reading instructions. The co-pilot kept his hands steady on the controls. And deep inside the cabin, without knowing why, people slowly began to feel a little safer again. Soon, the descent would begin. And that would be the real test. The moment came sooner than anyone wanted. Ground control contacted the cockpit with a calm but firm message. The descent had to begin. Weather patterns were shifting nearby, and delaying any longer could make things worse. The co-pilot took a deep breath, his fingers tightening slightly on the controls. The twins felt the weight of that breath. This wasn't the part where they simply supported him. This was the part where everything depended on clear minds and steady hands. The co-pilot spoke softly, almost to himself. "All right, we're doing this." One twin moved closer to the instrument panel, ready to watch every number. The other opened the descent checklist, turning each page slowly, careful not to skip anything. They already knew half the steps, but the seriousness of this moment made everything feel heavier. He adjusted the throttles gently, beginning the controlled drop in altitude. The plane responded with a low hum and a slight forward tilt. Inside the cabin, people gasped as they felt the shift. Descent wasn't dangerous, but today, every small change felt like a warning. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, comforting passengers, offering water, reminding them to breathe slowly. They didn't explain the details, they didn't need to. The way they carried themselves showed that, even in fear, they trusted what was happening behind the cockpit door. In the cockpit, the twins worked in perfect sync. One watched the altitude drop, calling out numbers clearly, never rushing, never panicking. The other read instructions one line at a time. The co-pilot nodded with each step, making the required adjustments. Then a soft vibration ran through the plane. Not turbulence, something different. The co-pilot quickly checked the systems. "Wind's shifting again," he said quietly. The patch of crosswind they had seen earlier was beginning to affect the descent. Not enough to cause danger yet, but enough to demand precision. The twins instinctively leaned forward, watching the displays closer, alert to even the smallest movement. One pointed at a slight drift to the left. "It's pulling again," she warned gently. He corrected it right away. The other twin read the next line from the checklist. "Stabilize pitch, confirm speed, adjust trim." He followed each instruction, and the plane steadied again. But the passengers felt every shift. A woman began crying softly. A young boy clutched his toy, trembling. A man closed his eyes, whispering a prayer. The human fear in the cabin was its own kind of turbulence, spreading from row to row. The co-pilot exhaled shakily. He wasn't just fighting the wind or the plane. He was fighting the pressure of every life on board. And the twins could feel that pressure too. But they didn't let it break them. They held themselves steady, their small voices grounding him in the way no adult voice could. "We're okay," one of them said. "We're with you," the other added. Those simple words held the room together. At 10,000 feet, the plane shook again, stronger this time. The twins grabbed the back of the seats to stay balanced. The co-pilot worked quickly, adjusting the controls with sharp precision. The plane steadied, but only after a tense few seconds. Outside the windscreen, clouds thickened ahead. Ground control warned them of a mild turbulence zone before final approach. Mild turbulence on a normal day wasn't scary. But today, everyone felt its meaning differently. The co-pilot tightened his harness. "We're committed now," he said quietly. The twins nodded. They understood. Once the plane passed a certain altitude, there was no returning upward. Only forward. Only down. One of the twins wiped her palms on her pants, trying to keep them dry. Not because she doubted herself, but because she wanted nothing on her fingers to cause even the smallest mistake when reading or pointing. The co-pilot asked them to prepare the cabin. He needed the attendants to secure everything. One twin relayed the message calmly through the intercom, her voice surprisingly steady. The passengers heard a young voice giving safety instructions and looked at each other in confusion. But the tone, it was comforting, real. Human. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot whispered, "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm glad you two are here." They didn't smile. They didn't act proud. They simply nodded and continued working. The plane descended further. The ground was getting closer. The wind was shifting. The passengers were holding their breath. The hardest moment was almost here, and the twins knew that the next few minutes would decide everything. The plane broke through the last layer of clouds, and the ground slowly appeared below. Patches of green, silver roads, and a distant runway waiting like a thin line of hope. The passengers pressed against their windows. Some whispered prayers. Others simply held onto each other. No one knew that two young girls were standing inside the cockpit, helping guide the aircraft safely toward the earth. Inside, the co-pilot's hands remained firm on the controls, but his breath trembled slightly. The twins stood close, one on each side, watching every number shift on the screens. Their focus was sharper than ever. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Ground control's voice came through again, giving final approach clearance. The co-pilot acknowledged the instructions, his voice steady but heavy. The twins sensed the pressure weighing on him. It wasn't just landing a plane. It was landing a plane after battling stress, turbulence, wind, and fear all at once. One of the twins began reading the final landing checklist. Her voice was calm, steady, almost gentle. The other twin watched the glide path readings and altitude, calling out numbers as they changed. Together, their voices created a rhythm that kept the co-pilot grounded. The plane approached the runway. The wind picked up slightly, nudging the aircraft. The passengers felt it immediately. A few gasped. A man tightened his seatbelt. A woman held her child close. Everyone waited for the moment when the wheels would touch the ground. Inside the cockpit, one twin pointed out the drift early. "It's pushing right again," she said softly. The co-pilot corrected it with a smooth movement. He wasn't fighting the plane anymore. He was working with it, guided by two young voices who seemed to steady the entire atmosphere. The runway grew larger ahead. At 500 feet, the plane shook lightly. Nothing dangerous, but enough to make the moment even more intense. The co-pilot focused completely, listening to the twins as if their voices were part of the instruments themselves. Altitude steady. Glide path good. Speed stable. The co-pilot eased the plane lower. In the cabin, silence felt almost sacred. People didn't dare to speak. Some closed their eyes, trusting whatever was happening behind that door. At 100 feet, the twin on the right whispered, "Keep it level. You're perfect." The co-pilot didn't answer, but his jaw tightened with determination. 50 feet. The plane floated for a second, almost weightless. Then the wheels touched down, softly, cleanly, smoother than many normal landings. A wave of emotion spilled through the cabin. Gasps, cries, laughter. Some people clapped without even thinking. Others covered their faces with their hands, overwhelmed with relief. But landing wasn't the end. The plane still had to slow down. The co-pilot applied the brakes gently, keeping the aircraft centered on the runway. The twins watched the speed drop, calling out the numbers just as they had practiced on simulators so many times at home. And then, the plane finally rolled to a calm, full stop. The cockpit fell quiet. No alarms. No checking. Just silence, and the sound of deep breaths finally releasing. The co-pilot leaned back in his seat, his eyes closing for a moment. He wasn't just relieved, he was grateful. Deeply, emotionally grateful. He turned to the twins. "You too. You were incredible." They didn't boast. They didn't act like heroes. One simply said, "We just helped." The other added, "Anyone would have." But everyone knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stood up. Not everyone would have stayed calm. Not everyone would have walked into a cockpit and worked like part of the crew. The flight attendants opened the cockpit door then, their eyes full of tears and pride. When the passengers saw the twins step out behind the co-pilot, a stunned silence moved through the cabin. People stared at them, whispering in disbelief. A woman finally asked, "Those two helped land the plane?" A man near the front whispered, They saved us. And then, without anyone telling them to, the entire cabin erupted into applause. Loud, emotional, grateful applause. Some people stood. Others cried. A child waved at them with both hands. The twins looked shyly at the crowd, overwhelmed by the reaction. The co-pilot placed a gentle hand on each girl's shoulder and said, "They gave us all a chance. Remember that." As the passengers began to disembark, many stopped to thank the twins personally. Some hugged them. Some simply whispered thanks with trembling voices. But every person who walked past them carried the same expression. Gratitude mixed with awe. It wasn't just a landing. It was a moment that would stay with every soul on that plane for the rest of their lives. And for the twins, it became the day they realized that courage doesn't wait for age. Sometimes it comes from two young voices saying, "We can fly this."